Church, I can tell you I have enjoyed every moment of getting to know Dr. Cedric Williams, and I have learned something every single time I've met with him. I do want to encourage you that if you take notes and journal, I do that mostly a lot of times because I don't remember things. But I would encourage you, boy, don't just sit back passively, be like my third or fourth grade teacher would say, sit up straight in your chair, be attentive, listen carefully, and write some notes down because it will be worth it this morning. I'm going to continue to take notes up here, and we're going to talk through things. Dr. Cedric, would you just introduce yourself to everyone for us this morning?
Yeah.
I'd appreciate it.
Good morning, PBC. Hey, I'm glad to have the opportunity to be able to be here with Pastor Jarrod and Pastor Josh. Josh, I'm so glad that it worked out with you and Cassie. So glad. There's nothing like a young, zealous preacher being love's executioner, from stage. So,
see, I'm learning so much already.
I don't know where you are, but I'm glad that it worked out as well. Oh, there you are. Hi.
Good.
But yeah, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here. So thank you this morning to have this great conversation. You asked me a question to tell a little bit about myself. So I'm from Livingston Normal. That's where I was born and raised for the most part. Important parts of my background that I think that are worth sharing. So in 9/11 was my senior year of high school. I left right after that to go into the military. I served for 3 years on active duty, and I've been in the military ever since. So I just passed 18 years, which is kind of crazy at this point in the reserves. During my time in the military, that's really was the catalyst for my interest in psychology. And so after I got out, I started working at Eastview Christian Church down in Bloomington Normal. That's where I went, Josh and Cassie, when I was a pastor there from 2007 to 2012. And then shortly after, my wife and we went to seminary in Pasadena. So got a PhD in clinical psychology and theology as well. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. My wife is a marriage and family therapist. We have 2 kids. We've been married for 12 years and having a lot of fun. Being homeschool parents now, so because of COVID. So
whole new level of psychology.
Yeah, exactly. So I started a business a while ago, but the topic that I focus on predominantly is multicultural competence, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But that's a little bit about me, and most importantly, I'm a Christian.
Yes.
And so I'm glad to be here to have a Christian conversation with my brothers and sisters in Christ who I am just meeting for the first time today.
I love that. And I wrote down in my notes things I'm learning from Dr. Cedric Williams today. You won't walk away disappointed. You will learn today. If you come to this and maybe set even some preconceived ideas, and believe me, all of us have those preconceived ideas. I do. And so if you can set those aside and listen carefully, I think you're going to not only hear in humility, he would allow me to say this about him, you're going to hear genius. Just some really godly counsel for us as a church and for me as a Christian. And I've thoroughly enjoyed getting to know you. So thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it. Let's dive in.
Yeah.
Sure. About a month ago, we've been in Ezra. About a month ago, we finished up a long series in the book of Ephesians. And Ephesians has, the Apostle Paul had a lot to talk about in the area or in the arena of reconciliation. First in our reconciliation to God through his Son, Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. And without that reconciliation, we would be separated from God eternally. Mm-hmm. But there's also this piece of racial reconciliation or reconciliation with one another. So where have you seen it? What's been your experience in the church when it comes to us recognizing the need for reconciliation or addressing it, but the inability or the unwillingness to actually do something about racial reconciliation? So would you speak to that to start us off?
Yeah, I think that I would initially start off to say that one of the things that happens when we do become Christians is, we get different names like beloved or a part of, and one of those names is ambassadors of reconciliation, right? And so that there's a calling for us to be ambassadors, to be people, to be the embodiment of a Christian life, and to be able to reconcile God and humanity through the things that we do, the perspectives that we hold, and the way that we share our lives with others. And so I think that part of being somebody who is reconciling, you have to have an awareness of what you are reconciling to and a need for reconciliation. And I think that for the church, specifically for the white evangelical church, I don't think that there has been a recognition of a need for racial reconciliation. It's kind of been this thing that is, kind of up in the clouds or hazy of unknown, or I didn't know that I needed to reconcile. Or, it's classified as like, well, I don't do these types of, I don't say the N-word, I don't say things that are hatred, I'm not part of the Klan, I'm not part of a skinhead, so what do I need to reconcile? There's just no need. And what I would say is, as a Christian, the concept of racial reconciliation, in my perspective, is a spiritual formation perspective. And coming from that is a part of sanctification of like, this is the world needs reconciliation, as we, as ambassadors of reconciliation on Christ's behalf, have the opportunity to step into conversations like this with our hands and our feet in order to make changes.
Is it just simply a passivity that we have as the white evangelical church, or could we even go as far as, and I don't know, have you explained this, could we go as far as it's possibly even sinful to be passive, or to think, this really doesn't affect me, I'm in a good place, or I see all of this going on in the world, but it's not here in my portion, so I just kind of sit back and let things happen and not be involved in racial reconciliation? Can it be a sinful thing?
Yeah, I think about it in the terms of when we don't acknowledge our own sin, right? And so when we look at something and say, well, that doesn't apply to me, and I close the book on it, whether it be like through the teachings of Jesus and say, well, that doesn't really apply to me, I close the book. Is that a sin? Is that a sin to be willfully ignorant in that, of saying, like, I'm not going to acknowledge that, that's not really me, I'm going to dismiss that? I would take that same type of concept and put it on top of what we're talking about with racial reconciliation, of saying if you feel like you can't see it, you don't think that there's a need for it, then I would say that it does. In my mind, that is sinful, because you're being willfully compliant or complicitly silent, which is something that the white evangelical church in America has been complicitly silent in race and racial injustice for a very, very long time. And so I think that in this point in history, you have a great opportunity to say, enough is enough. Let's lean in with empathy and listen and hear and make changes.
Excellent. When you're talking about listening and hearing and making those changes, there's a piece of that seems to me to have something to do with humility. And the fact that, as you've said, we're ambassadors for Christ, and some of his greatest attributes while here on earth as a human, Philippians 2, humility, gentleness, meekness, and how those three things aren't considered weakness, but they're actual great characteristics. And you actually teach and speak of a term that I would like for you to talk about called racial humility, multicultural humility.
Multicultural humility.
So you speak to multicultural humility, and I'd like for you to explain that for us. What does that mean?
Yeah, okay. So multicultural humility is just taking the time to be able to acknowledge that I have history and cultural identities that I hold that are important to the way that I view the world. For instance, I am a black male psychologist, father, husband, Midwesterner, soldier, infantry officer, Ranger qualified. All of these things are identities that I hold. With cultural humility, you take time to be introspective and say, how are those components of who I am, how have they shaped the way that I think about myself? How have those complexities and those cultures that I hold also I guess in some ways, moderate my interaction with other people and the way that I think about other people. And so I think that everybody has cultural identities that we hold, and some of them have intersections, right? Intersections of being black, or intersections of if you being a white male. Well, how does that interact with one another? So having multicultural humility is really taking the time to say, these things have shaped me. Being a pastor's kid has shaped me. It shapes what I think about the gospel of Jesus Christ. It shapes me about what I think about the world and the state of the world. Those are things that I hold, but I have to take time to actually reflect on them. And taking the time to reflect on them is a component of multicultural humility.
The first time that we talked or we met, I thought that we would get to this place where we would just talk about racial reconciliation like it's the most important thing. And you said it actually goes much deeper than that. And part of this is the multicultural humility. And even when you had shared that, and I've read some articles that you've written on it, I personally, this might sound really bad, but I'm thinking, how does the culture, how are they affected by humility? Not so much myself. So that when you explain it about multicultural humility as me looking introspectively, that I have to recognize that I grew up in the Midwest, and I have a lot of identities that I bring to the table, and I have to recognize that I have some preconceived either ideas or beliefs that I bring to the table, that I need to be willing to listen to what you have to say, because you have a different upbringing, or do you have different identities in your life?
Yeah, very much so. Like, just what you said, like you being in the Midwest and being raised in the Midwest. I've been raised in the Midwest. I've lived in different places, but like all of those things, they shape the way that we think about people. They shape the way that we interact with the world. Like, if the news that we watch, the news that we don't watch, what our parents told us about God, the way that we were shaped in church, who taught you. I think about that a lot of times, like cultural humility in terms of education. I've sat into formal education for years, and thinking about as a child being raised in a place where, when we have Black history, the first thing that we learn about Black history is slavery, as if there's not decades and millennia before that shaped Black history, and what that would have done to me or my colleagues, if we would have known those stories, right? And so thinking about all of those components and reflecting on it and how that interacts, or how that affects my interaction, I think it's another component that's really important.
Off subject a little bit, yeah. What about experiences that you've had? How have you experienced that differently? Like, I would read Black history differently than you would. And so how have those experiences affected you?
Yeah. Well, I think about it in a Christian perspective. I think that growing up in a church, which I might, that was, I guess, an intergenerational, multi-ethnic church, but I remember a lot of my Sunday school teachers were white, and the books and the Bibles that we would open up had white Jesus, white disciples, the Christmas, all of the nativity scenes that I've ever seen growing up for the most part were white, right? So what does that do, right? When you think about representation, when you think about, where's the place of me? Is this something that is also for me? And I think that sometimes white people have that perspective of, it's like, well, that's not a big deal. Well, right, it's not a big deal once, but it's a death by 1,000 paper cuts over a lifetime, right? When you have time after time where you don't see yourself in these representations of Scripture. I think I've told the story before, like, my kids going to a church, and the life lesson of the day was listen to God. And so all the little kids had big ears that they walk out with, right? Well, all the ears are white. So my kids with their brown skin, they have these white ears, listen to God. And it's kind of, it's in some ways it's funny. It's like, oh, well, that's kind of silly. But when your child asks you, where am I? Was Jesus white? Did Jesus look like Uncle Seth? What about that? What does that mean? Are all the disciples white? Every single one? No, just Paul was. You know, when and they're trying to think through this in their mind. And I think that even going to I'm kind of skipping forward, but, of talking about privilege.
Yes.
Of the privilege of not even having to think about these things. Like, this is the non-issue. I don't think about these things. I think that's when people talk about white privilege. Like, when you don't have to think about this isn't a discussion that comes up in your home. This is a discussion that comes up in my home continually, not just because it's important, but because my kids are trying to grasp their identity in a Christian society, right? In a predominantly white community. What does that mean for me as well? Where can I see myself? And so these types of conversations, I think, that are really important, in terms of just thinking about having cultural humility.
Let's talk about privilege a little bit, because there's, we could have the tendency, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this, we could have the tendency to see this phrase, white privilege, and have this guilt connected with it, and then we connect it, to help us with our guilt, we connect it spiritually as Christians to, well, what if these are blessings of God on our life? So how do you either separate those, or how do you make them work together?
Well, I would separate them. I think it's highly problematic to attribute whiteness to blessing, and then if you implicitly attribute whiteness to blessing, then you're implicitly attributing non-whiteness to curse, or whatever the opposite, or the antonym of blessing would be. And I think that that's highly problematic. So when talking about privilege, I think that the system that we live in America, right, and the way that we live here, like, it is set up and designed for whiteness, right? Historically, we know that just even from slavery, judicial systems, real estate, banking, all of those, voting, all of those were set up for predominantly white cultures, right? To be in positions of power. And so I think that that's what privilege is, of saying you're operating in this system that is privileged and is designed for you. Where I think that people of color, black people in America, that is not our story. We don't come into the system as being the privileged ones. At the same time, there are components in different systems that I do have privilege in, right? As a male. For instance, in the Army, I think that the Army predominantly, or historically, has been designed for men. Men have had plenty of opportunities to thrive. As a male in the Army over 18 years, I don't walk around apologizing for my privilege as a male, right? I just don't do that. What I do instead is I find ways and find systems, or find opportunities to be able to use my privilege to uplift and provide equity for my sisters of arms, right? Who might not experience the same type of privilege. And I don't look at it like, well, that's their problem. That's a woman's problem, right? No, it's my problem because this is inequitable, right? So I try to find ways in order to use my privilege, not apologize for it, in order to make a way for others. I think that we've talked about this before. Just the example of when I went to Ranger School, there was no women were not allowed to go, right? So there was no women that were able to go. They changed that, I think, in 2015 or 2016 timeframe. And so one of the things that I did was, when they changed that, I met with my battalion commander and said, hey, look, I would like to make a program of instruction that helps females who are wanting to go to Ranger School pass. And so taking the time to mentor, taking the time to be a part of, let's work out, let's do all of these things in order to help you be successful when you're there. That, to me, is a component of using my privilege, not apologizing for it, but doing something with it in order to say, I'm with you in this, I see you. Let's try to figure out a way for this to be equitable for you, because this is not just, this is not just your problem, right? So we're taking it to the race conversation. This isn't a black people problem, right? What's going on right now? This is not just a black person's problem that I have to, that's really sad for them. No, this is our problem as a community, right? So it's not solely on black people to fix this. This is a community problem that needs to be fixed and addressed. And as a Christian, right, and we really believe in image bearers, that we as human beings are the image bearers of God, and being ambassadors of reconciliation. This is all of our community responsibility to do something about it when we see any type of injustice.
So would I be correct in saying that you can leverage your influence or privilege both negatively, you could do that, but positively here, you're talking about not just systems, but especially in people.
Absolutely. Investment
in people.
Yeah, and taking it, and I think that's even what empathy is. It's not making it out to be like it's theirs, like their problem to fix. Sure. I mean, with privilege, this is something that we're doing together, right? This is something that we are working together in order to move forward, because we think it's important not only for a societal level, but as Christians. Isn't this a way to advance the gospel? Isn't this the gospel, right? Blessed are those. You talk about blessings, like what the most, I guess, famous passage of Jesus was in Matthew 5, right? With the blessing, blessed are the poor, blessed are those who are weak, or who are meek, or who are persecuted, who are oppressed. Like, this is a component of just living out the gospel, right? And I think the blessing is being a part of humanity. I don't think that that's the same thing as privilege, right? Because privilege is talking about an unequal system. But nonetheless, I think that it's a blessing and a responsibility of us to make changes to those systems.
You mentioned empathy. I wrote it down. I want to move that down a little bit and come back to that.
Yeah, for sure.
I really want to discuss empathy with you. But I want to go to the next level. You talk about multicultural humility as kind of foundational to a much bigger picture. And I remember when we first talked together, I said, I really want to have a conversation about racial reconciliation, and you said, that's the tip of the iceberg. There's so much deeper than that. Mm-hmm. And then you began to talk about this phrase, multicultural competence. Mm-hmm. And I went, what? What is that? And you explained it. I would love it if you would take some time to talk about multicultural competence.
Right. So multicultural competence, the way that I can think about it, it says 4 different components to it. One is multicultural humility, of understanding who we are and how those cultural identities that we hold have shaped us, how they formed us, how they help us to think about the world, how they help us to think about each other. The second part of cultural competence is having curiosity for the other, or whoever the other might be. The other could be somebody who is different than me, that holds a different cultural identity for me, that holds, maybe lives at a different part of town than I do, has different experiences than I do, has different upbringing, social, economic status than I do, right? And being curious about that, and having that curiosity of asking and inquiring and responding and engaging, and not just seeing from a distance and seeing their struggle, but actually getting up close and saying, what's going on? Let me hear about what's going on in your world, and how does that affect you, and how does that also affect me of being a person who lives in this world?
Can we just, sorry for the interruption, to talk about that one, you'll get all 4 in, I'm sure. Yeah. But that second one, being curious, that's an incredible shift probably for a lot of people to walk into a store, see someone that's different than them, and engage in a conversation rather than just going, oh, there's something going on in their life, or they're different than I am.
Right.
How do we change that mindset?
Let me. I'm not saying to next time you're at Kroger, to say, hey, you look different than me. Hey, what was it like for you growing up? That's please don't do that. That'll be really scary.
Thank you so much,
especially during COVID. Please do not do that. But I do think that when you have opportunities to lean into these types of conversations, that you ask those questions, or you engage your kids or your children about these. Maybe they're curious, or they have friends that come from different cultural backgrounds, or you have a book you want to read, or you have a book club, or there's an online community that maybe is different than what you have come to know as your adult, but you're curious about them, and then instead of saying, yeah, I'm curious about them, but never mind, you're curious, and then you engage. And so taking that next step forward, That's a component of cultural competence.
Listening, asking questions, getting, and I
Yeah.
liked your word engaged there, get engaged in a conversation, actually in a relationship.
In a relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Go on to your next ones.
Yeah,
I interrupted
no,
you. Sorry
no,
about
it's
that.
fine.
First
And then-
one was multicultural humility. Second one is curiosity and asking those questions.
And then the third component of that would be cross-cultural skills, of trying to figure out ways to be able to, what I use the term is ruptures and repairs. So when there are individual or societal ruptures, this is what we're seeing currently, right? This is a rupture in the community. One of the people that I work with is I work with the police officers at the city of Bloomington. And so we talk about this language a lot, where there is a rupture in policing, right? And then within the community, right? And so whose responsibility is it to repair? And so during the trainings that we have with them and we communicate, we're talking about ruptures and repairs. And so that's a cross-cultural skill of saying, hey, I might not have been the person that was individually, so to say, that was in charge of making the rupture, but I have a responsibility in order to try to make the repair because I see it, right? And as a Christian, I think that this is just a component of being a Christian, is that if there are societal upheavals, if there is injustice, if there is pain, we being reconcilers of Christ and being, ambassadors of reconciliation, we do have a role and a responsibility in order to step forth and to be the change, change agents in the world. And I think that that's what it means to be a Christian. The fourth component of multicultural competence is just deliberate practice. And that's taking the step, right, of saying, hey, I'm going to actually implement these things in my everyday life. Wherever that looks, because it's going to look different for everybody in their cultural context, right? These are not like set mandates, right? Or they're not meant to be prescriptive. They're more meant to be descriptive of how can you step into these things. And you as a pastor, in my context of living in Pontiac, right, Illinois, some people are saying, well, how can I do this in a community that's predominantly white? My occupational is predominantly white. Well, there's still opportunities in different ways for you to be able to reach across. It's not just only for racial or ethnic reconciliation, right? It's thinking about even just people who are different in different ways, right? And so I think that we all benefit from that, not just looking at solely race, but a lot of other components that encompass race as well.
I appreciate that a lot. And so maybe a sub point underneath that for you in the future with your notes is use your illustration of Kroger to remind everybody, like,
to not do that.
Don't do that. Don't do that. Hey, you're different than I am. So I appreciate that. Deliberate practice, engaging in conversation, getting outside of ourselves and outside of our comfort zones.
Sure.
We talked about that a little bit in our conversations before meeting today. When I first came to you, I said, oh, there's a demographic, and that's how I labeled it. This was horrific for me now that I think about it. But there's a demographic that our church is not reaching. And I believe that I'm empathetic, and I want to be empathetic. I don't want to offend someone. I don't want to say the wrong things. But I was consumed with this idea of we're not reaching a demographic, and you were like, dude, that's the wrong idea. Mm-hmm. And so could you speak to that a little bit, just maybe where there's been some deficits in the church, and it wasn't my thinking, about how we think about reaching out into our community?
Yeah, I think that the context of that conversation was we're talking about a lot of church communities and a lot of church leaders when we are talking about what's going on now, societal upheaval, societal changes, and the conversation quickly jumps to, okay, well, we want to be more diverse. How do we expand the benevolence fund, right? How do we, expand our food pantry or start giving away more clothes or, and I think that what I typically encourage pastors to do is to take a step back from that conversation and say, let's start with empathy. And start with open ears and open mind and open hearts to be able to say, what is going on in this situation? How can I listen? How can I lean in? How can I really try to seek to understand the pain that people are going through at a very visceral level? I'm not making it out to be like that. That's just something that's their pain. but it's something that I feel pain because you are in pain and you are a part of me and you are a part of my community. And I think that starting there is an important step for anybody who's trying to go towards solutions, but you can't jump to solutions first. You have to actually start with empathy and being in a relationship with somebody long term.
What would you say to someone that they might be uncomfortable? I've spent some time with some youth ministries, inner city work, and stuff like that, but to be uncomfortable, to have that conversation or to start down that road of deliberately engaging.
Yeah, I would probably say welcome to life. There's a level of feeling uncomfortable about these conversations because they're hard conversations. I think it's earlier, it's like, coming here to Pontiac, Illinois, and having a discussion about race in a predominantly white congregation in a predominantly white area is an uncomfortable and hard and difficult thing to do. This is not just something that I wake up every day and say, yeah, let's go. This is go time. It's a hard conversation because I know that there's people who disagree. I know that there's people who are angry, possibly at you for even having me here, right? And so I think that what we can do is that we can try to figure out ways to say, hey, look, this is hard for everybody, but there's a longevity to our relationship to say, if you make mistakes or if I make mistakes, along the way, we're talking about race and pain, is that, of course, we'll have a rupture, but there's ways to be able to repair it because we have committed to be in this engaged relationship as brothers in Christ throughout the long haul of the lifespan. And so I think that, taking that perspective of saying, hey, look, this is going to be hard at some level because there's going to be some sort of discomfort or disagreement, and that's okay. That's just a component of us living in a world in the way that it is. So
to get to the point where you and I continue to grow in our relationship and conversation things where I'm talking with you and I no longer see a black man and you no longer see a white man, that we're just so united together. Is that kind of the idea to that, or?
No.
Okay.
No, I would not say that that's the idea. I would say...
I have my pen. I'm ready. I start talking.
I would not say that that's the idea at all. I would say...
At all.
I would say that this is kind of a term that, a lot of people are having, the color blindness, right? Of I just want to be colorblind and I don't want to see color. I would say that please see color and see how beautiful it is that God has made color and diversity in every nation and every tongue, right?
Yeah, Revelation 7 tells us that.
Exactly.
Every tribe, every tongue, every nation.
Yeah, so I think about that. It's like that God didn't want us to be color blind, but God is saying that I made things in color and they are beautiful. And if they are different than you, they are beautiful. And you are different than them, you are beautiful, right? And I think that is the gospel of really understanding the image of God that is laid inside of God's creation, is that really believing that. Yeah.
We're in Genesis now. We're in the very beginning, that you're made in the image of God.
And it was good.
Yeah, and it was good. So you are made in the image of God, and the color that you have is because God has created you that way.
Right, absolutely.
Love that. Yeah. Thank you for the loving and gracious lesson in that moment. I appreciate that so much. Some of this is not scripted. 1994, I went to Promise Keepers. It was the first one they had in Indianapolis. 60,000 men, and I can tell you predominantly white. 60,000 men. One of the speakers got up and shared about a book that he had written called Breaking Down the Walls and helping with racial reconciliation in the church. And for a little while, I would say maybe even a couple of years, we saw this incredible uptick in the church where we're paying attention or at least having conversations about it. And then to me, it seems like it's just completely dropped off. And you've even said that the white evangelical church, we don't talk about racial reconciliation much, or even that idea of breaking down those walls. What would you tell a congregation? What would you tell a church? Can you give us some advice on how to sustain momentum because of some things that have happened in our culture in the last 6 months, it's opened the door for someone like me to, hey, finally, I need to talk about this. I need to be involved in this. I can't stand by, be passive in it. What can you do? How can you give us some advice, if you would, where we've been maybe shown a deficit in our inability to sustain a conversation?
I think that one of the things that I would say is, I guess the two parts of this answer is, the first part is that I think that sometimes the white evangelical church believes that they are the Christian standard. And what I mean by that is this, is that most people do not come into a service globally. Christians do not come into a service, sing 2 songs, have a dynamic speaker, have a screen. That is not the standard globally of what Christian is. And I think that sometimes the white evangelical church in America believes that this is how you do church and this is how you are a Christian. And I can tell you that being across the globe, that that's drastically not the case.
Wow.
So I think that having a larger perspective of what it means to be a Christian is important, for one.
That's great.
And for two, this conversation is not something that is all of a sudden coming up to the surface. It might be coming up to the surface specifically for white evangelical churches, but this is
we're behind.
This is something that the global church has been addressing, for years, and really trying to see the way forward of understanding that this is important to be a Christian, and understanding that. In a way to sustain these types of conversations starts with the top up, right? So people like yourself who are in positions of not only influence, but in positions of authority, right? To say, it's important to me to have my congregation to talk about these things or to have these conversations for the long haul. I mean, we all know that this conversation is not going to be in the forefront of the news, leading into, March of 2022, let's just say, or, June of 2027. But what will our church, our local church, what will our global church have to say, the white evangelical church specifically, what will they have to say about these types of concerns and issues? How will you be the forerunner, if you will, in racial reconciliation for the sake of the gospel? And I think that this is the time. It's like, Christians, hello, like, this is our time to say, this is what it means to be a Christian, to be a Christ follower, to be somebody who is salt and light. Do we really believe that? And how are we living that out? Or is it just like, I will just continue to come to church, I'll continue to do my thing, and really you can just perpetuate the system. There's no changes, right? And it'll be fine. You can live a life and be fine. But if you're talking about living dangerously as a Christian, I think that engaging in this conversation for the long haul is a component of living dangerously. And I think that that's what we see in Jesus, and that's what we see in the disciples and the people who said first that they were Christians.
Sure.
Yeah.
I appreciate that, and I take that. I recognize that the onus can be on me as a pastor and as a shepherd, and I want you to know and to hear it from me. I will absolutely sustain this conversation over the long haul. I think the Bible's clear with it. Just the life of Jesus, the things that Paul wrote, makes it a priority for us to continue to have these conversations.
Right.
And so I appreciate that a bunch. What could individuals do? So that was for me as the shepherd. So you aimed that right at me, and I appreciate that. But what could we do as individuals, not just as a congregation or a church? What would maybe be some things that we could do as an individual?
I think it's individuals. I think that you start, starting one with empathy, to learn.
Be willing to learn.
Be willing to learn. Be willing to say, what is this really all about? Like, when people say things that are triggering, like white privilege, and I get really upset about it, have you really asked yourself the question, what does that really mean? When people talk about systemic racism, what do they mean by that? And not just what does the people that look like me, walk like me, come to church like me, vote like me, what do they believe about it? But what is the other people, what are they saying about this? And where's the merit at? Where's the middle at? Where is there something that I can learn So I think that that's one thing that you can do. I think that reaching out and using your privilege and not sitting around being apologetic of your privilege, because that once again makes you the subject, right?
Selfish.
Yeah, it makes you the subject, right? Like, we're not apologizing for our privilege. We're trying to figure out ways in order to make that equity. So if you are in a position of authority and influence, like, how can you lean back and say, hey, like, I can see you, and I want to be with you as you struggle through this, as we struggle with this together and have this conversation. I could join them. And I know that there's mixed feelings about people joining book clubs, but virtually you can engage conversations. There are literally Facebook things for everything of people saying,
so many groups.
Yeah, I want to be woke. I'm sure there's an I want to be woke group or something. You know what I mean? Or having a conversation with different churches. Virtually, right? Engaging in a small group, reading books, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, reading books like The Color of Compromise, reading C.T. Vivian, that there are Christian thought and Christian authors that have been speaking about this for centuries, right? And I think that sometimes the white evangelical church limits to these prominent voices, right? Whether it be Giglio or Piper, which I love those guys, right? I think that they have a lot of good things to say, but there's a lot of other people too that do not come from those backgrounds that share different cultural identities that have a lot to say about Christianity and the Christian life. And I think it's important to be able to to have water from a deep well, if you will, of thinking about, like, man, like, there are so many other stories of Christian thought and Christian perspectives throughout the lifespan.
I love that, and I would appreciate it if you would be willing, for my benefit, is to maybe get some of those resources written down and get those to me, and I can get those to people that are interested
I'd be happy
here.
to.
I'd love to do that. Let's hit one more thing here, one that's a little bit more difficult, maybe even to speak to, because I want to stay away as best as I can from some kind of a political thought or ideology, or even what that discussion could bring. But I want to ask you this question because I think it's one that needs to be answered. What do you do with a conversation where you've heard the statement, Black Lives Matter, and then someone else comes along and says, well, all lives matter. Unborn children's lives matter. The poor, they matter. All lives matter. It's not just Black Lives Matter. How would you speak to that kind of discussion, or even someone saying that?
Oh, wow. Thank you for that.
Yeah. And be apolitical? I don't know. Yeah, just
well,
what's good
I don't
out
think
of
it's a political statement, honestly.
I appreciate that.
For one, I think that Black Lives Matter, period, pause. I think that that's important to be able to state as a human being. I would probably say that in order for all lives to matter, Black lives have to matter, for one. For two, I think what people are communicating with that is that, I think you use this as an example of a lot of times, like when I think about cancer, right? We have all types of cancers. There's breast cancer, colon cancer, lung cancer, stomach cancer, liver cancer, all these types of things. Imagine if it was Breast Cancer Awareness Month and you're at a rally and somebody's talking about breast cancer awareness, and they're talking about raising funds and really drawing a lot of attention, like the NFL does or something like that. Everybody's wearing pink. Like, this is an important time of life that we're taking and pausing and saying, hey, this is important. Let's talk about this. Imagine that you're at that rally and then all of a sudden somebody stands up and says, hey, guess what? Liver cancer matters. Or all cancer matters too. Yes, sir, you're right. We believe that. We're actually just taking time right now in this space because we've allotted to raise funds, to draw attention towards research for breast cancer. If you take that same type of analogy and you put it towards Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, I would implore people to really consider it like that. It's not saying that Black lives matter more. It's saying that historically Black lives in this country have been marginalized, right? And have not been treated as equal or equitable, right? And so we're taking a small time and space in history to highlight Black lives. It's not to say Black lives are more, Black lives are better. No, we're just saying Black lives are important because you don't need anything. And talking about the privilege and the things that we discussed, you already know. You can look on the screen, you can look on the TV, you can look on the Bibles that are printed out, or the Bibles that I grew up were printed out, and you could tell that white is represented in White Lives Matter, right?
Right, we already know that.
We already know that, right? Because that historically has been the default setting, right, for America. So when you take time to say Black Lives Matter, that's what it's really getting at, right? So I think that it's very, very important to differentiate of saying that it's not saying that Black lives are better. Black lives are, it's just saying Black Lives Matter, period, pause. I think a lot of times people get tripped up because what they try to do is they'll try to pair, right, something like, oh, well, if you say Black Lives Matter, you're saying you're anti-police. No, I'm not. My family members are police officers. I work with police officers. I'm pro-police, period. Period, pause to that. I'm also Black Lives Matter, right? And I think that that's important, that you don't have to get entrapped in this dichotomous thinking. If I say this, then it's that. If I say this, if I'm for this, that means I'm against that. Like, no. That is not a thoughtful approach to any type of argument or any type of engagement or any type of discussion. So I think that we have to think outside of that. What is really going on here when people are saying Black Lives Matter, right? Period, pause. Nothing more, nothing less. Because historically that has not been the case in our societal context.
So instead of reacting, we act with, let's ask more questions, or let's maybe even get to know that person, to hear from them better.
That know that person, or know that community, or know that message.
Oh,
right?
Great.
Of really leaning in. Instead of being reactive, try to be responsive. Like, how can I be responsive instead of having a knee-jerk reaction? It's like, how can I be responsive, and just to sit back and say, okay, what are you trying to say here? What are you trying to, what are you saying? I think about it all the time as being a psychologist. Like, I'll listen to kids who come in, or adults that are coming in, and they're really struggling with something, and their behavior is this way, and all I do is, what would it be like if I just focused solely on their behavior, right? No, I'm not focusing solely on their behavior. I'm focusing on who they are as a human being, and that has driven that behavior, right? So that's a deeper perspective and a deeper lens, not just looking at, well, what are you doing with your behavior? No, I try to look underneath the surface and really try to understand a person. And I think that as a Christian, that's really what we're looking at, right? And taking the time and not making it out to be like that's something that's other. It's something that we are a part of as a community, and that's why it's important.
And that goes all the way back to what you said at the very beginning, that we are ambassadors for Christ, ambassadors of reconciliation. This can't be a passive thing. No. And so I appreciate that. And I really appreciate the clarification of all lives matter. I think we as a white evangelical church needed to hear that today. And sometimes when we hear things like that, that it might be hard or difficult for us. And we don't like conflict, or we don't like difficult things, but my goodness, this is a conversation that has to happen. Right?
Yeah. I think that it's important to have these dialogues, these discussions, and like you said, like it's not easy. Like, it's not easy to come here and have these conversations. And I think that these are so important, because I think that now is the time as Christians. It's like, oh my goodness, what an opportunity for us to be. You talk about like a city on a hill.
Nice, yeah.
Like, man, if that is the depiction that we see in the scriptures, of being a city on a hill and to be a light to an onlooking world, what an opportunity for us to step in and say, hey, look, like, we see this and we're going to do something that's different. And I think that that's what it means to be a Christian, is to, when you see injustice, when you see pain, you don't stand by and just watch it. You get in the mix of it and say, what can I do? How can I be a part of this as a Christian? Because that is important, and you are important, as my Creator has told me about His creation, period.
I love that. Didn't get to one of our questions. That's fine. Don't care. I've appreciated that, appreciated everything that you've said today. Does it mean that I have a high level of empathy if I cry when you cry? I mean, does that give me a high level of empathy?
I guess so.
Or not?
Yeah.
Just at least the love for you. I have appreciated every single moment that I've spent with you over the last couple of months. And I thank you so much for speaking truth in grace and love to this church, and I hope that we're a part of reconciliation
Amen.
at a greater level than what we have been, and I want to be a part of that. I'll take the onus of that leadership.
Thank you,
And
Jarrod.
appreciate
Thanks for
that. Would
having me.
you thank Dr. Cedric Williams
Thank
for being
you.
here today? So thankful
Thanks, Jarrod. Appreciate it, man.
for him. I appreciate that. Dr. Williams, I know the different things that you are involved in, not only in your psychology and in your business and leadership and training and working with police officers. That's just big. That is a lot of stuff for you to be working through.